This is Module 5 in the Smart Sales System training program, how to manage the sales process. We're going to break down each of these steps and explain what you should do in each of these steps. And then when you're talking to prospects, whether you're calling them, meeting with them, wherever you are in your sales process, you can stop to think about which of these steps am I in, and then that can help you to figure out this is what I need to do and this is how I need to organize this particular call or this particular meeting. And we'll start with the initial contact. This is the first time you're basically speaking with a prospect. And of course, it could be a cold call. You could call up someone and you're talking to them for the first time. It could be a cold email exchange. It could be when you meet someone when you're networking. It could be an inbound call. Maybe the prospect calls you. Maybe they've gotten your email address from the website and they're sending an email. It could be a website chat. They've ended up on your website and they're asking questions in a chat window, LinkedIn or Twitter. And so basically, it's the first time that you're interacting with the prospect. It's the initial contact. And the goals for the initial contact are, what you want to do is you want to pre-qualify. And we're going to have a whole training module on qualifying and pre-qualifying. So I'm just going to skim the surface real lightly here, and then we'll dig into it deeper in a complete training module all by itself. But fully qualifying is trying to determine, is the deal for real? Does this prospect have money, authority to purchase, and whatnot? Pre-qualifying is a light qualify. All we want to do when we pre-qualify is we're not trying to determine, do they have money or do they have decision-making power? What we're trying to determine is, does it even make sense for us to keep talking? Does it make sense for us to schedule a meeting to start the conversation? You don't want to schedule an appointment with someone where they just completely don't fit with what you sell. So pre-qualifying is asking a few questions just to determine, does it even make sense for us to talk? The other goal for the initial contact is to build interest in talking. So we're not necessarily having to build interest in getting them to buy, because we're not focused on the decision. We're focused on selling the next step, which is the conversation. So we just need to build interest enough to get the prospect to agree to move to the next step. And the next step is talking more. So it's a low level of interest, but we do want to try to build some interest. And the close at the initial contact step is not for, do you need what I sell, and signing the prospect up. The close is just for the next step in the process, which is the conversation. The structure for the initial contact can look different ways depending on the format. But if you're talking to someone, say on a phone call, or maybe it's a website chat, or you meet someone at a networking event, the initial contact should be between 2 to 5 minutes. If it's longer than 5 minutes, one of two things that's happening. Either you're moving too slowly in what you need to accomplish in the initial contact and you're dragging it on too long, or you've progressed the conversation step at the same time as the initial contact. And that can happen a lot of times, and there's reasons why you might want that to happen. We actually refer to that as an instant meeting, and we'll come back to that later in this discussion. But try to keep the initial contact and everything you're trying to accomplish in this sales process step to between 2 to 5 minutes. The way to structure this interaction with the prospect is, remember, we want to be more about the prospect. We're doing consultative selling. Product selling is all about me and my product. Consultative selling is all about the prospect. So we want 80% of the initial contact to be about the prospect, and then we can have the remainder, the last 20%, on you. The way that you could organize that is that if you make a cold call, the first major portion of the cold call, the beginning, the middle, can be about the prospect, and you can achieve that by asking good questions. And then the end of the cold call can be about you. So that's where you're talking more about the prospect, and then you wrap up with a little bit of information about you to build a little bit of interest and curiosity and interest in talking more, and then you go for the close. And we'll talk more about how that applies to your cold calling and your cold call script in the cold calling module, which is next. And we've provided you with different categories of questions, and some of those questions are good to ask in the initial contact. So which questions are good to ask? Of course, your pain questions are good to ask, because your pain questions will help you to pre-qualify. If a prospect has pain points or challenges that your product can help to solve, then there's a good reason to keep talking. If everything is great where your product can help, in other words, like if you were a doctor and you had medicine and the patient is very healthy, then there's no reason to talk more. So pain questions can be very good to pre-qualify, to get an engaged conversation going, to make the initial contact more about the prospect. You could also ask current state questions, and these can accomplish some of those same things as well. Identify if there's a reason to keep talking and learn more about the prospect. So during the initial contact, questions to ask are pain questions and current state questions. Now we're progressing to the next step in the process, which is the conversation step, which is just having a more deep conversation where both parties are interested in being there. Sometimes you're on a cold call and the salesperson is the only one that's interested. At this point, both parties are interested in talking more. And so the format for the conversation could be scheduling an appointment with a prospect where maybe it's a phone appointment or a face-to-face. Could be an online meeting. You could meet the prospect for coffee or a drink or lunch or food. Could be an extended cold call. The conversation could happen at the same time, as I've already mentioned, where you cold call, that's the initial contact, and you're operating in that 2 to 5 minute window. But then you keep talking and you get into a good conversation. Then you've progressed to the conversation step at the same time. So it could be an extended cold call, could be meeting someone at an event. So you meet, have a quick introduction, and then you get into a deeper conversation. Then certainly that can happen when you're networking. The goals for the conversation start to change a little bit. So ideally at this point, we've already pre-qualified, because pre-qualifying is just determining, should we talk more? Well, at this point, you're talking more. So pre-qualifying is done. Now we want to qualify, and qualifying is determining how real of a fit is this? How much does the prospect need what I sell? How much time am I comfortable investing in this prospect? And it's your step of qualifying that will help you to do that. And again, we'll talk about qualifying more in a separate module. The other goal for the conversation is to gather prospect information. This is going to be one of your best times during the sales process to gather prospect information. The initial contact is too short of a time window to gather a lot of information. The next sales process step is where you're going to be talking more about how you can help. So this is where you want to ask a lot of your questions and learn more about the prospect. And of course, you want to build interest in what you sell and who you are and the company you work for. And the close, when you're in the conversation step, is for the next step in the process, which is not to sell the product, but to sell the explanation. And we'll talk more about what the explanation is next. And so from a structure standpoint, typically the conversation's between 10 to 60 minutes. On average, when you're trying to schedule a conversation, normally you might try to close for a 15 to 20 minute call. But if your product is very simple and there's not a lot of information to learn or a lot to talk about, you might be more around 10 to 15 minutes. If you sell something more complicated, you might be looking at more of a 30 to 60 minute type of meeting that you schedule with the prospect. At this point, in terms of the amount of attention, the attention between the prospect and the attention on you and what you sell starts to change. So in the initial contact, we were all about the prospect. 80% of the interaction should have been about the prospect. Now that starts to balance out, and we can do 50% on the prospect and 50% on you. And what that might look like is, let's say that you schedule a 30-minute meeting with a prospect. Try to spend the first 10 to 15 minutes just talking about the prospect, asking questions, learning about them. And then you can spend the last 10 to 15 minutes about you. And what that might look like is asking questions, learning about their challenges, and then you wrap up with how you help against those challenges and with just enough details so that you can try to sell the explanation step, which is the next step. And as I've mentioned, the conversation is your best opportunity to ask good questions and to gather information about the prospect. So different questions to ask. I'm going to put back up here pain and current state. Yes, you may have already asked many of your pain and current state questions already prior to the conversation, but you might have many that haven't been asked yet. So this is a place to pick up any questions that haven't been asked in the pain and current state area, or you might want to ask them again if you have more time now to dig into more of the details. The conversation is also a good time if you want to ask any desired state questions, any organization questions. And of course, this is a great opportunity to qualify the prospect, ask your qualifying questions to try to determine how well the prospect fits with what you sell. So those are the questions to ask during the conversation step. Now, at this point, we're moving on. We've identified that we could potentially help the prospect, that they need what we sell, that they're a good fit. And we close the prospect on the explanation sales process step, which is where we can explain how we help them. And so the format of this, with a lot of products or services, this might be a formal presentation, sharing a slide deck. Could be a demonstration of some sort, demonstrating software, demonstrating something mechanical, how it works. In some cases, the product might be very simple, and there might not be a need for a slide deck or a demonstration. And it could simply be sharing a proposal or a quotation where you're showing the different options. Maybe you're a repair person and you go to someone's home and you've looked around, you've done done an inspection. And then the explanation step is just sharing your brochure and the 3 different options that the prospect can choose from the back of the brochure. So the explanation step could be some deep explanation that takes an hour long. It could be a 5-minute explanation, and it could just be sharing a proposal, sharing a quotation, sharing a list of options. And so the goals for the explanation step, I'm going to put back up here, qualify. Ideally, during the conversation step, you should qualify in terms of determining how well the prospect fits with what you sell, but you might not have had time to do that, or you might not have been able to ask all of your qualifying questions. So we're going to still continue to qualify the prospect. We're going to qualify them during the conversation step, and we might want to continue qualifying them during the explanation step. What that might look like is after you've done the presentation or the demonstration, you might continue to ask qualifying questions towards the end of that interaction. This is going to be your best opportunity to build interest in the product. So in the previous steps, we were just trying to trigger curiosity, build enough interest in getting things going and selling the next step. This is where we're trying to build interest in our solution to their needs and explain how our product can solve the problems that they're having or address what they're wanting to do. And the close at the explanation step is closing for the purchase, closing for the decision. The explanation step, it could be anywhere between 30 minutes to 2 hours. Again, as I mentioned, depends on how complex what you're selling is in terms of how long the explanation usually will take. But at the end of the day, you're explaining how you can help. So however long that takes. And at this point, if we get back to the amount of attention and where it goes, if you recall, the initial contact was 80% on the prospect and 20% on you, just enough attention on you at the end to close for the conversation. What we're going to do at the explanation step was we're going to flip that. So now it's 20% on the prospect and 80% on you. What that might look like in real life is that, let's say that you're delivering a presentation, a set of slides. You might spend 10% of your slides on the prospect. Ideally, would be in the front of your presentation. So a great way to do that is to open the presentation by sharing, this is what we've learned about you. These are the challenges you're experiencing. These are your interests. This is what you're wanting to do. And then you share how you can help and how what you sell or what you have to offer maps or matches to that. And so that's where 10% of your presentation will be on the prospect. So that's 10% of the 20%. Then you share how you can help. That's the 80% on you. And then after that, you might want to come back to the prospect and have 10% of the end of the presentation back on the prospect. And that might be where you close or talk more about the prospect or ask more questions, ask more qualifying questions, ask your closing questions. And regarding questions, basically here are all of the different categories of questions that we've given you: pain, current state, desired state, organization, qualifying, closing. Hopefully you've asked a lot of these already. Ideally, you want to ask the pain, current state, desired state, organization questions during the conversation and get those out of the way. But certainly you might not have had an opportunity to ask all of those questions. So there might be some of those you want to pick up at the end of the explanation. But for the most part, the questions you'd want to focus primarily on at the end of the explanation step would be any qualifying questions you haven't asked yet, maybe qualifying questions about the decision-making process or where the decision is made or funding. And then of course, closing questions to try to close the sale, validate interest. So we'll talk more again about qualifying, and there's a whole training module on closing by itself. But just to point out the different questions to ask, you could ask any of these questions at the explanation step, ideally at the end. So you make the majority of the explanation is all about you, how you can help, and then you try to close by again coming back to the prospect and learning more about them and trying to close. So that's the sales process that we recommend you go through. It's pretty simple, 3 steps, and it fits with most products or services, regardless of what you sell. If you sell something very complex or if you sell a more simple product, now can be different for different prospects or different products. And as I've already discussed, some of these steps can get consolidated. If you look at them, of course, you can go through each of these as a different interaction on a different day. There's nothing wrong with that. But certainly some of these can get consolidated where they happen at the same time. For example, I've already discussed, sometimes you might call someone and you end up talking to them for 20, 30 minutes on the phone. And what you end up there is you end up with an instant meeting. So you've progressed from the initial contact, from the cold call, to actually having the conversation and a real conversation at the same time. Another example of this is when you meet someone at a networking event. So you're just having a quick conversation. Next thing you know, you've talked to them for 20, 30 minutes. So this can happen very easily, and these can happen a lot. Now, what I would say to you is you want to be aware of what an instant meeting is and when it's happening, because you kind of want to try to avoid instant meetings for the most part. There are some times when it makes sense to have an instant meeting, and But in most cases, you're better off identifying when you're starting to fall into an instant meeting and stopping, and then scheduling the conversation as an appointment or a follow-up meeting on another day. So let's talk about when it's good to have an instant meeting. So if you end up on the phone with a prospect that you think is difficult to get a hold of, and you don't know if you'll ever be able to get them on the phone again, you might just want to get as much out of that interaction as you can and stay on the phone with them as long as you can. And if you can roll into an instant meeting and do it all in the same interaction, that might be the best thing to do. Another time where instant meetings make sense is if the initial contact is a face-to-face. For example, maybe you do cold walking and you pop by someone's office and that's the initial contact. Well, you're already there. So it might make sense just to have an instant meeting since you're there instead of scheduling something on another day and then you go back. Another time where instant meetings make sense is that if the product is fairly simple, meaning so you've ended up in some sort of initial contact and there's really not a ton to talk about, instead of getting back together on another day, you could just kind of power through and have an instant meeting. Or if the prospect wants to move quickly where, they're on a tight deadline, they don't have time to regroup and get together on another day, just power through and have an instant meeting. As I mentioned, in most cases, it makes sense to be aware of what an instant meeting is and to recognize when you're starting to fall into it and to try to avoid it. The reason why is because you will typically get more time and attention on another day. Let me give you an example of when you should try to avoid the instant meeting. So let's say you end up on a cold call and you start to get a decent engagement with the prospect, and the prospect starts to ask you questions back, like, what is the transition like? Or what is the setup like? Well, at this point, you have a prospect who's asking a question, so they're somewhat interested in what you're trying to talk about. And at this point, your natural instinct is probably to answer their question or their questions because you start to get excited. You might have made a bunch of cold calls where you couldn't get a hold of somebody or you got rejected, and now you have someone asking you questions, so you get excited and then you start to answer their questions. And what happens is then you have a very quick, short conversation. But what you could have done is you could have used their questions as an opportunity to close for the meeting or the appointment or to move the prospect to the conversation step of the process. And that would look something like this. Hey, that's a great question. It's actually a little bit of details in terms of me trying to answer that. And you might have other questions. Why don't we stop here? Because you're asking a few questions. And what we can do is we can schedule a call on another day. We could do an online presentation, do a screen share, and I can answer your question about setup and go into more detail about that. And then I can also answer any other questions you might have. So are you available next Tuesday morning? And what I did there is I used their questions as an opportunity to close for the next step in the sales process, which is my goal. My goal is not to sell the product and to answer their questions. My goal is to set the appointment, schedule the meeting, get to the conversation. So when they start asking questions, I use that as an opportunity. And what happens is when you follow your natural instincts and you just get excited about the questions and you answer the questions, you end up in an instant meeting. And then there's less of a reason to get back together on another day, and you end up getting less time and attention. The other thing is that when you stop and then you regroup on another day, both you and the prospect can become more prepared, not only prepared for the answers to the questions, but more mentally prepared. If you call someone out of the blue, they're not mentally prepared to get into a deep conversation about their needs and what they sell. But if you put a meeting on their calendar and they know to expect you, they can be more mentally prepared. You can be more mentally prepared. And like I said, when you start to fall into an instant meeting, that's usually a closing opportunity. Another way these steps can be pushed together is that you might end up with something similar, which is called an instant explanation. And this is basically where you have the initial contact, you schedule the appointment, schedule the meeting, you meet with the prospect, you're going through those steps, you're learning about them. And then where that conversation goes, you end up sharing a presentation or sharing a quick demonstration or going into detail about how you can help. And this can happen all the time. And there are many reasons why this makes sense. Very similar to the instant meetings. So if the conversation is fairly straightforward or the product is not very complex or advanced, there's not a lot to talk about, you could end up doing these at the same time. Or if you're with a prospect in person and it's just easier to flow right into the explanation at the same time, just go for it. Same rules apply. You might get more attention from the prospect if you schedule it, do them separately, do them on different days. But sometimes if you're with someone or if someone's difficult to get with, You can crush these out at the same time. And the biggest factor might be how complex or simple the product that you sell is that will determine whether or not you just do an instant explanation. You also could end up in situations where you end up on a one-call close. And what I would say is some salespeople may be listening to this and may think, I don't know if any of this applies to me because I did use a one-call close sales process. My product's not complicated. I don't need to go through all these different steps. But what I would say is even if you do a one-call close where you call someone up and you close that sale on the phone, on that call, you still could and should go through these 3 steps. Let me give you an example. So let's say you cold call someone up and you spend the first 2 to 5 minutes asking them a couple of questions. Well, that's the initial contact. And then based on their answers, you confirm with them that there might be something interesting to talk about and you get their permission to keep talking for a few more minutes. Then you've just closed for the conversation. Then you ask a few more questions and share a few more details. Now you're in the conversation step. After you've asked those other questions, then you're able to then share 3 different options that the customer can choose from, and you've built interest in those options, and then you close the prospect on the phone for one of those options. That was a one-call close. But what I did there is I still went through all these different steps. I had the quick initial contact focused on the prospect, then I closed to get a few more minutes of time, and it kind of balanced out a little bit more back and forth where we're learning about each other, and then I explained options at the end and then closed. So I still went through these steps, and what I would say is by still being aware of these steps, knowing what you need to do in each and how they kind of break down, and knowing where you are when you're talking to the prospect, it can improve your ability to manage the sales process. And that's really what we're talking about here today, is having more clarity around the steps of the sales process, being better able to manage the different steps that you're taking someone through. And by having that increased awareness and understanding, it can also impact all of the other things you're trying to do, like cold calling, emailing, getting around objections. So all of these concepts I'm sharing with you here today are going to keep coming back. That's pretty much it for today. The next module is cold calling.